April 27. Cloudy and windy. We came 26 miles up the Heeley River with roads very rough and dusty, uphill and down. Sometimes we could hardly get along between the river and hills. One of Mr. Gatewood's horses got mired in the river, and he got some Spaniards to pull it out. We are camped tonight at Mission Camp. Have plenty of wood, water, and grass. They are trying to elect a captain, but have considerable contention and no captain. April 28th. Clear and warm. We came 16 miles over rough sandy roads up the hill and past one ranch. We are camped tonight at Antelope Peak in a flat on the Heeley. We got in camp at 3 o'clock and have plenty of wood, water, and grass. April 29. A very warm morning. We came 14 miles over rough roads to Mohawk Station, where we stopped and got water. Then came 11 miles over rocky plain, through miserable-looking country with nothing growing on the plain but cactus. We came down a big rocky hill into the bottom and camped for the night with good grass, but have to carry wood and water some distance. Mr. Kirkland took Dick DeLay, a young man from Arizona who wants to go to Texas, in with him. During these days, the Shackelfords were in the indigenous territories of the Yavapai, Apache, the Quatsan, the Cocopa, and the Peepash Maricopa. I'm Jen Gladius, and this is the Halanaki Deep Dive, a podcast about the process of mapping and analysis for historical and archaeological research using open source tools. In this episode, I'll start off with a little bit of in-law etiquette from the 1860s. Then I'll discuss the Butterfield Overland Mail Route and how to digitize places from historical maps. Let's dive in. The three entries that I read in the intro are all from April 1868. When the Shackelfords were traveling in Arizona, going across deserts and following the Butterfield Overland Mail Route, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But first, I have been waiting months to bring up this topic of in-law etiquette, and now is the time. I'm so excited. Ever since I reread the 1868 diary a few months ago, after I had been intensively studying the 1865 diary and felt really gotten to know Ruth's mindset in 1865, and then I read the 1868 diary, I've been wanting to delve into the topic of etiquette between in-laws in the 1860s. And this is why. In her 1865 diary, Ruth almost always refers to Atwood Gatewood, her brother-in-law, through her husband's sister. She almost always refers to him as At, which she spells either with one T or two, which was very confusing at first because I'm like, why are you capitalizing At there? And it's because she was referring to her brother-in-law. What you might not have caught, but maybe you did, is that in the April 27th entry, she refers to her brother-in-law as Mr. Gatewood. And that is always the way that she refers to him in this 1868 diary. So from that April 27th, 1868 entry, quote, one of Mr. Gatewood's horses got mired in the river, and he got some Spaniards to pull it out, end quote. She no longer uses this nickname to refer to her brother-in-law, which she only refers to him as Mr. Gatewood throughout this 1868 diary. It is a noticeable switch. I noticed it after I'd spent really intensive time thinking about these people and their 1865 trip. And it's now referring to him in her private diary as Mr. Gatewood. It caught me when I first noticed it. So a few things to keep in mind. I've talked about this before, but Ruth Shackelford did not intend these diaries for public consumption and definitely not for publication. And that's one of the reasons why I find this fascinating. So if we look at etiquette from that time, which I checked a couple of etiquette books, there was the 1840 Etiquette for Ladies and also 1851's The Ladies' Science of Etiquette, and I'll include links to both of those sources in the show notes. But looking at etiquette books from around that time, women were not even supposed to refer to their husbands by their first name to anyone. Like maybe their very, very close friends, they might call their husband by his first name, but never in public. So very formal, even when you're referring to your husband. And so there's no way that she would be referring to her brother-in-law, the man who married her husband's sister. There's no way that she was referring to him by his nickname in public. But it's entirely possible, and I think it's very plausible, that Ruth and Frank Shackelford probably referred to Atwood Gatewood as At amongst themselves. And that's why she wrote about him in that way in the 1865 diary. And in that diary, you can also tell that they're very close. Like, towards the beginning of their trip in May, like, At buys Frank a rifle. And there are many other times where the two households really act as if they're one. There really doesn't seem that much separation between the two households, between the Gatewoods and the Shackelfords in that 1865 diary. And that's what makes it so striking and interesting that by 1868, that informality is gone. I mean, it was never there in public. Ruth never would have referred to him that way, probably. But in her private thoughts, in her private writings, by 1868, Ruth is no longer referring to Atwood Gatewood by his nickname informally. And I suspect, although there's no way to prove it, but I suspect that this switch in how Ruth refers to him it reflected a change in the once tight-knit bond between the Shackelfords and the Gatewoods. They're still family in some way, although the direct bond is gone. Just sometime between the last time Ruth mentioned Atwood Gatewood in her 1865 diary, which was right at the end on November 2nd. And then between that time and when they left San Bernardino in April 1868, that close relationship seems to have diminished. Now, it's not completely gone. At Gatewood did decide to travel with the Shackelfords back east, but he doesn't go all the way back to Missouri with them. And I think that's just another item of proof that their relationship was no longer quite as close. But what happened with him is a topic for a later episode, so you'll hear more about this in the future. I want to turn our attention to the route that the Shackelfords took on this 1868 journey. Now, when they went from Missouri to California in 1865, they took the Platte River Road and then headed south to Salt Lake City and then took the Mormon route into California. They take a very different route leaving California and heading back east in 1868. In 1868, they followed, for the most part, they deviate a bit when they get to Texas, but they followed what was known as the Oxbow route because it looks like a giant oxbow. It like swoops way down and is a longer route. It's also called the Southern Overland Route, and then also called the Butterfield Overland Mail Route, and I'll talk a bit about why it was called that in a bit. This route followed earlier trails that, of course, would have been based on indigenous trails. But it became more traveled after 1857 when the Overland Mail Company was awarded a 6-year contract to carry the U.S. mail. And the route is often known as the Butterfield Overland Mail Route because the president of the Overland Mail Company at that time was John Butterfield Sr. And so this route took the southern route, so there would have been a middle way to go slightly further north to reach California. So the big thing was they needed to go from Memphis, Tennessee and St. Louis and get to California because the mail was very slow and they wanted to speed that up. The USPS had issues about how long it took to deliver mail there, if that sounds familiar at all, except that at that time it was because it was very slow to get there with your horses and wagons. So the route that this took, if we're heading east from California, so the route went through California and actually went all the way San Francisco and down to Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is where it then heads east, going through Southern California, dipping into present-day Mexico a bit, then going through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, the present-day Oklahoma, which then was Indian Territory, before coming to Arkansas, and specifically Fort Smith, Arkansas, where the route then split off, one going to Memphis, Tennessee, and the other to St. Louis, Missouri. And so this is a long route. It's much less direct than the route that even the Shackelfords took in 1865 following the Platte River. It added a lot of distance, but there were certain advantages to this route. Number one, only very rarely would the route become snowed, would snow fall on this route, and so it would be useful year-round. There were also much flatter. Like, it definitely goes up hills, as you heard in the introduction where Ruth was talking about these difficult hills they had to go up. But overall, like, they didn't have to go over the mountains that of Wyoming that caused so many problems for the Shackelfords in 1865. So, 1857, the Overland Mail Company is awarded their contract to carry the U.S. mail, and they're supposed to start it in a year, in 1858. And they needed that time because they had to establish stations along the route. As you may know if you know the geography of that area, the Shackelfords were traveling through deserts, and Ruth mentions this often, that they're baking and getting ready for however many miles of deserts that were coming up. And so the Overland Mail Company, to actually create this route to take the mail using stagecoaches, their mail coaches, what they had to do was establish stations, staff it with people, and provide provision, so grain for both the horses and food for the people who were traveling, and especially the drivers, but most importantly, cisterns in many places. They would establish stations where they could in natural water sources, but traveling across the desert where you have horses that definitely need water if they're going to keep their speed up, they had to build cisterns. And in some cases, I believe they also brought water in from other locations to fill those cisterns. And this route was a great success. The Overland Mail stages could travel the 2,800-mile route in 25 days. And that was due to the frequent changes of horses. They had very quick pit stops at the stations, and those stages traveled nonstop. Now, the Overland Mail Company contract was supposed to continue until 1864, but the outbreak of the Civil War stopped their use of the route in March of 1861. The stagecoaches were moved north to keep them out of Confederate hands. The infrastructure of that route remained, however, which kept the route in use until 1880, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. Thus, it makes complete sense that the Shackelfords, who were traveling from Southern California to Texas, would take this well-established route. So it might have been definitely a more direct route, but the Shackelfords traveled back east through Texas, thinking maybe we'll stop in Texas, maybe we'll settle there. They were undecided about actually going completely back to Missouri, although eventually they do. So in the April 27, 28, and 29th, 1868 entries that I read in the introduction, 3 stations from the Overland Mail Route are mentioned as places where they stopped, not necessarily for the night, but definitely to get water. So she mentions Mission Camp Station, Antelope Peak Station, and Mohawk Station. But of those 3, the only one that Ruth referred to as a station was Mohawk Station. Otherwise, she just said Mission Camp and Antelope Peak, not mentioning that they previously were stations. But it was at each of these 3 stations that the Shackelfords traveling party was able to get water, as well as to gather wood and have grass for their livestock. Now, most of these stations do not exist any longer. Some of them do. I certainly would love to go travel and see them someday. And with that no longer really existing, only a few of them have their names in geonames.org gazetteer, which makes it difficult to actually follow the path now. But the stations are clearly marked, along with the Overland Mail Route itself, on historical maps that I'm using. So there's two, one from 1865 and one from 1867. And I'll link to both of those. They both belong in the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection, and I'll link to both of them so that you can see them for yourselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those maps and getting locations from historical maps in just a second. But I just want to tell you that links to those maps and to other resources that I used as reference about the Butterfield Overland Mail Route are in the show notes. And definitely, if you check out one thing, check out the blog that was dedicated to the route, which helpfully lists and maps the stations, because that was a really cool resource. All right, so let's talk a little bit about my process of mapping. So first, a little celebration. I have finished adding all of the 1868 diary entries into NodeGoat. So the diary entries with basic tagging of places is done. It was greatly helped because the Shackelfords end up staying in Texas in one spot for over a month, which really, really cut down and made it easier. And the 1868 diary does not include their entire trip back to Missouri. It actually stops at the border between Texas and Oklahoma. But I'll talk about that on a later episode. So where I am is that I have basic locations that could easily be found in geonames.org and streams that were easily found, which I'm going to say this now. Streams in Texas, there are so many of them. I came across one, Spring Creek, and there have to be 100 different Spring Creeks in Texas. So I was like, we'll skip the streams for now, which means I'll get back to it. And I'll get back to the entries. But where I'm starting at this moment is using historical maps from the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection to digitize places from the diaries that don't show up in geonames.org. If you're a supporter on Patreon, I earlier posted a video about how to open a map from the David Rumsey collection in QGIS without having to download the map, which is super useful if you just want to check out the maps and look at where things were located. However, when it comes to digitizing locations from those maps, I found the georeferencing that was available, the actual placement of the map in its location, not as precise as I would hoped. Here's a side note. In my past, when I was working on my MS at SIUE in geography, I spent a few years doing an assistantship where I was georeferencing coal mine maps from Illinois, and I feel I got really good at georeferencing maps. We were using specialized software, Airnest Imagine, which I definitely do not have access to now, but it's this process of georeferencing is something that is very, very useful to have, especially when working with historical maps, where they don't necessarily have modern coordinate systems on them, not even latitude, longitude. And so you need some way to put them into locations. So using things like corners between states or town locations is super useful. So looking at maps on the David Rumsey site is free, and I believe it's free to open up different georeference map in QGIS, so as a map tile. But to actually download maps, you can download one, and other than that you need a membership. So I now have a membership to their site so I can download the maps and georeference them myself, because that's definitely something I liked to do. And I'll post a new video on Patreon for supporters there on the process of georeferencing in QGIS. So just showing a little bit about it, not every little bit, but just if you want to see what the process and what the difference is between before I did my own georeferencing and after, it can be stark. So I started with georeferencing 2 maps that show places from the end of the Shackelford's 1865 journey and the beginning of 1868. And these maps also record stations from the Butterfield Mail Route, which was great. And these maps are really nice. They show all these stations from the Butterfield Mail Route, which is great. They show where the route itself must have been. And so I'm able to add locations that I otherwise would not know them because they do not show up in GeoNames. But because I'm looking at locations on 2 maps, because they don't both show all of the same locations. Like one of them doesn't show much of California. It's more spotty there. And so I'm using 2 maps because it gives better coverage. But because I'm using 2 maps, I can see that locations from the 2 maps, even after I've georeferenced them, those map locations do not entirely match up. And this is unsurprising. A map is only as good as the person who created them. It's very difficult to actually draw maps with very nice, accurate positional locations. And so this brings up an issue kind of related to what I talked about in the last episode. But not quite. So last time I talked about certainty and uncertainty and how maps lie. And this issue is not quite the same because now this is an issue of precision of locations, which is something that can and should really be quantified. And I had a conversation with my friend Sandy, who's a listener. Thanks, Sandy. And we talked about that certainty versus uncertainty and quantifying it. And I was talking about how certainty, I don't want to place a number on it, but I'm leaving it categorical because in some ways, putting a number to it makes it like you're trying to be more precise about it. And I don't think I can be. I think it's more of a category for me. But really, precision of location, especially where you can do an analysis of it, is really important. And to quantify precision of locations, it means assessing quality of data sources. And I've been talking about, I think from the very first episode of this podcast, about using geonames.org as my main source of data. Well, it's important to actually look at where does geonames.org get their information about locations. And they have a whole list. They list it out. They're very precise about it. And for most of the places in the United States where geonames.org gets their information is from the USGS Geographic Names Information System. And so this is something run by the US government, and they have standards with it that I can look into and get a sense of precision and how to quantify it. And one thing I need to actually write up is how I'm deciding between places and how I'm doing any categorization of certainty, uncertainty, and precision itself. Because when I look up a place in GeoNames, if it's a large city, like right before the entries I read at the beginning, the Shackelfords went through like Yuma, Arizona. And so that's a modern place, but which location out of the many, many, many that show up on GeoNames do I actually use? And so I'm trying to be, I standardize which type of location I use, which is related to the administrative place, but it'll be helpful for other people looking at my methodology later to have that written down. And I also want to say that geonames.org locations are, the ones I'm using are provided in latitude, longitude, in decimal degrees with 5 decimal places. The process, though, to assess locations from historical maps is going to be a statistical issue, one that I'm trying to work out the process. And in the end, I'll probably do analysis and processing either using Python or R, whichever one seems better for me at the time. But I started doing a little bit of literature review, and I found a series of academic papers that were open source, so I could actually download them, yay. And these papers were assessing accuracy of locations in georeferenced maps from a series of military mappings by the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the Czech Republic. So a topic very, very far away from what I'm doing, but I looked a little bit at their papers, and I think they might have a method that I can use, that I can compare locations from multiple maps. So having the location on only one map will be problematic, and it's probably going to it's going to be an assessment of partly of how well my georeferencing was and how precise the location was by the original map cartographers. So I was going to start digging super deep into that. And then something else that I talked about with my friend Sandy was about precision. When is precision and certainty categorization actually necessary? And so I've had a couple questions about maps from this work and when things would actually be available. And so I want to share a little bit about my plans for making maps and analysis. So hopefully you know that I plan to create a series of maps and visualizations based on Ruth Shackelford's diaries. But this is going to be an extended process. I intend to get very detailed, look at different things in Ruth's diaries, things that I've brought up in different episodes, and do different maps and visualizations working together to really understand them. And so those very detailed maps and visualizations will need precision and an understanding of how precise are locations, and also the certainty and uncertainty of locations, because those maps and visualizations will be large scale, meaning they cover small areas in high detail. But the maps I intend to create first are going to be maps that show the 1865 and 1868 routes in their entirety. And because they're going to show very little detail of a large area, most of the United States, these maps will be small scale. And because of that, they can't show a lot of detail. And so the precision and analysis of how precise the location is really unnecessary, because the maps themselves showing these places like Mohawk Station that appears one place in the 1865 map and another slightly different spot in the 1877 one, that means that when you're looking at it in a very large area, it's going to look basically the same place. But I still intend to show the routes with use visualizations that show that this isn't certainty, that there is uncertainty in this. And I'll have to play around with how I visualize it, but probably like a fairly wide width, because that should show not one very super precise place, and maybe a bit of blur. We'll see what looks best when I actually get to making the maps. But what this also means is that the identification of locations and looking at the precision of that identification and certainty of identification is going to be an iterative process for me. I'm going to go over the process in the diaries more than a few times so that I can first start out with these small-scale generalized maps soon, hopefully within the next couple of months, and then later create large-scale, more detailed maps and visualizations later, within a year hopefully for this first of these, but not in the next couple of months. That's my intentions for making maps and visualizations. As soon as I release maps for sale, because I will sell these, I will certainly announce it here. You can email questions or comments to deepdive@helenaki.com or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at HelenakiGIS. Show notes with links to resources mentioned in this episode are available on the Helenaki website and on Patreon. If you enjoy the Helenaki Deep Dive, please recommend it to a friend or leave a review on Apple Podcasts so more people can find it. You can also support the Helenaki Deep Dive financially by becoming a supporter on Patreon. For as little as $2 per month, you get access to behind-the-scenes content, while higher tiers of support include digital copies of maps and other visualizations related to the podcast. The Helenaki Deep Dive is written and produced by me, Jen Globius of the Helenaki. The theme music is Deep Ocean Instrumental by Dan O of danosongs.com. Thanks for listening.